We have been studying the life divine, our focus being the last 6 chapters, where Sri Aurobindo gives us the framework of the practice of the integral yoga. But we chose to begin from the chapter ending just before these 6, the chapter titled Rebirth and Other Worlds. And we chose this because here Sri Aurobindo reveals to us the secret of a practical immortality by which we are able to consciously make a transition from one life into the next without losing the continuity of consciousness, without losing the benefit of all that has been gathered and built up, and taking it all into the next in a continuous flow. Here we saw over the last few weeks that Sri Aurobindo describes the priority of the soul's evolution, and that is not the memory or the surface personality and its continuity. Rather, it is the growth of consciousness and the wide variety of experiences. Remember that the soul is, after all, a part of the divine consciousness and contains within it infinite potential. And therefore its full flowering must have the possibility of an infinite unfoldment, of infinite facets of consciousness. And therefore in each lifetime, the soul takes up a new facet, a new personality through which to grow and develop certain powers of its possibilities. And then withdrawing at the end of the life, it absorbs the essence that is gathered, puts forward a new personality for the next life, drawing upon its past experiences, drawing upon its past growth and evolution, sometimes tiny elements of various personalities combining to make for the new. If this is the requirement of the soul, then in order to be able to make a continuous transition from one life to the next without losing continuity of consciousness or personality, this personality that we have today must fulfill 3 conditions. The first is that it must become powerfully individualized on the surface. That there is an individuality integrated that we will be able to carry across. Second, that it must become so much one with the inner consciousness of the inner mind, inner vital, the inner mental Purusha and the inner vital Purusha. That the outer being integrated with the inner, the consciousness which we have on the surface will be able to remain in continuity when it withdraws into an inner state of awareness. Otherwise, just the fact of going deep within involves a loss of consciousness. The surface personality goes to sleep and there is no continuity. So this second requirement is the integration between the outer and the inner. And the third requirement is that this personality should be open plastically to the progressive action of the infinite. It is as if the infinite is working upon the personality to act through it. And if the personality is now to be able to serve into the next life for the new requirements of the soul's experience, it should be plastically open to whatever demand the infinite places upon it, which means an extraordinary plasticity, but also a multifaceted plasticity, and an ability to continue to grow without limits. Because it's the infinite, the growth which the infinite demands is also infinite. And so, is your personality sufficiently integrated, individualized? Is it sufficiently integrated inwardly to your deepest inner poise of consciousness, or even all the way to the psychic presence? And is it sufficiently plastic to be able to adapt and continue to grow without any rigidities of any kind? This has to be developed not only in the mental being, equally in the vital being. And with these two developed, we should be able to withdraw from the physical body with our personality largely intact, retaining these, even the larger part of the development of the mental and vital personality and its memories, until we prepare to take birth again into the next body. With this, Sri Aurobindo explains, the survival of the consciousness is achieved. It's an immense victory of the soul, mind and life over the inconscience and the limitations of material nature, because after all, it is the material nature, that is the body, consciousness and its limits, which are compelling all these parts to become dulled and rigid and superficially bound. And so it will be an enormous victory. But such a survival could only persist in the subtle body. The being would still have to discard its physical form, pass to other worlds, and in its return put on a new body. But then question comes, can not the same permanence or immortality of the soul, which has now been brought to some degree into the mind and the vital, can it not be taken all the way to the physical body? And in answer to this, he takes up this last part of the discussion in the last paragraph of the chapter. The physical being could only endure if by some means its physical causes of decay and disruption could be overcome. And at the same time, so this is the first condition, physical causes of decay and disruption to be overcome. And at the same time, the second set of requirement, it could be made so plastic and progressive in its structure and its functioning that it would answer to each change demanded of it by the progress of the inner person. This is what we are now going to explore. The first part of the requirement, that there must be some means by which it can overcome its physical causes of decay and disruption. This we discussed to a great extent last time. We saw the distinction between physical causes and psychological causes of decay and disruption. So much of our body, in fact, is largely disrupted because of the psychological disharmonies that we have. But there are equally physical causes which need to be overcome. If not, for example, it is possible that the body would simply wear out from excessive work, or the body would be exposed too much to poisonous circumstances or radiation of a certain kind which would break down the cells, preventing its regeneration, and you could still have the body break down. He is not speaking here of a supramentally transformed body. He's not yet, at least. He's hinting at it in the longer development, but still, can the body itself be made simply resilient enough that it can persist and overcome the physical causes of decay and disruption? To a great extent, as we discussed last time, there are physical means by which this can be done. In particular, there is a technology which has largely now been lost in its practice, but the theoretical part is still remaining, in the science of Ayurveda. And the technology is called Kaya Kalpa. Kaya meaning the physical body, and the Kalpa is its transition or transformation, where a method is described. In fact, there are 18 kinds of Kaya Kalpa. Some which are more superficial, some which are more profound in how they transform the body. The most profound of these requires the body to be placed in complete darkness for a period of several weeks, if I recall right, more than 40 days. But during the time there's a special diet, no exposure to light, the person has to remain completely still, no activity. If possible, he should be prayerful and in meditation. Now you can imagine what it would be like for somebody who does not have a basic spiritual training of mind to be asked to remain lying down in darkness, no reading, no television, and remaining simply relaxed with no other activity for a period of 40 days. You cannot do it. You cannot do it unless there is a deeper spiritual preparation in which either you are in a deep state of meditation or at least in a semi-meditative state for unending duration. But if you can survive those 40 days with the particular requirement of diet, you come out looking 20 or 30 years younger. Now people have demonstrated this. The demonstrations are on record. And one of the most interesting books which I have seen is of one such person who went through in his lifetime 3 times through a Kaya Kalpa exercise. And so he ended up living 182 years. And when he first did his Kaya Kalpa, he was a prince in those days during the time of Mughal rule. He had chosen to leave, and then he went to Rishikesh, leaving everything, became a ascetic, wandering in the Himalayas. He wanted to die with a spiritual orientation in an aged body, and he met a saint there who had the knowledge of Kaya Kalpa. He said, I will make your body rejuvenate if you then help me rejuvenate. And so he went through that process, which he describes to some extent in his book. And then subsequently he walked for long distances all the way to Burma, came back to India and so on. He went through a second one, all the time pursuing his spiritual life. And by the time he reached his third Kaya Kalpa, he was already in such a deep state of contemplation and meditation on the divine, because he was on an ascetic path. He had lost interest in his body. And he said, well, you can do what you like. And his leaving the body was almost incidental. He could have perhaps gone through a physical regeneration, but he was not interested anymore. This shows you already, although you can regenerate the body by such means, what is the choice of the consciousness? And Sri Aurobindo points out here in the footnote, which we will see shortly, that even if you can compel the body to remain like this, unless the consciousness, the soul, finds it worthwhile, it will not continue. It can just shed the body as it chooses. So there are means by which physical causes of decay and disruption can be overcome by physical means, even by psychological or other means. But still, this is a requirement. For a very practical reason, the body should continue. We discussed last time that although there can be organic degeneration, it can be replaced because the cells are always replacing each other. So in this case, he is not speaking of the cells becoming permanent, only the organs being able to continually regenerate. And this is doable with existing knowledge, even in modern medicine. Many of these things have been discovered, though they are still kept secret or experimented upon away from public sight. In the distinction that Sri Aurobindo makes in the supramental transformation, this even would not be. The organic degeneration would not be there, and even the cellular degeneration would not be there. Because you see, in the way it is described here, the body sustains, but the cells are decaying, dying, and being replaced all the time. In the supramental transformation, even the cells would have this divinized consciousness by which they would no more be bound to the need for decay and death. They may still choose, or the soul may still choose to shed simply by withdrawing its consent, but there would be no compulsion in the cellular consciousness. So there are different things which we are speaking of. Here, the physical being could only endure if by some means its physical causes of decay and disruption could be overcome. And at the same time, it could be made so plastic and progressive in its structure and its functioning. Now, Sri Aurobindo has used these words carefully. We need to explore what that is. What is plastic as distinct from progressive? Plasticity is the ability of the body to adjust to any changing circumstances. So, for example, if your body is used to living in a dry climate and you move to a very humid climate, you will find it difficult to adjust for a while. Or if your body is used to a cold climate, it's difficult to adjust in a warm climate, or vice versa. If the warmth now continues to increase, I am adapted to temperate warmth, but not extremes of heat of the desert perhaps, then the body has to struggle to adjust. But if the body is plastic, it's able to adapt reasonably quickly. As an example, all of us, if we were to climb up the Himalayas, go to a height of 5 or 10,000 feet, we will find it a little difficult to breathe. You will start breathing a little more deeply, a little more rapidly. Your blood oxygen will drop because there are not enough red blood cells to hold the limited quantity of oxygen which is in the air, because the air pressure is lower. And yet, if you rest for a day or two at most, the body produces more red blood cells. Its ability to absorb oxygen enhances, and it is able to retain sufficiently in the blood that your panting breath has now settled and has become normal. If you stay for a few more days, you will find you can even start jogging. But the body quickly adjusted by increasing the number of red blood cells. Many Olympic runners, they train on high altitudes so that their red blood cell count shoots up, the body's ability to hold oxygen increases, and then when they have to go for the Olympics, they will move from there straight to the lower plains with their body still full of the red blood cells and have the advantage of it. But it still took a few days for the body to adjust to this. If your body is more plastic, it will take less number of days. If your body is less plastic, it will take a few weeks perhaps. With age, the plasticity drops. In fact, one of the markers of aging is the drop in plasticity. So plasticity is this adaptation. We should be able to adapt because circumstances will change. If you want to extend your bodily life for 100 years, already you can see how much has changed in the world. And not only in terms of temperature and climate, but in terms of what you have to do to survive. And there are people who find it so difficult to adjust to new vehicles of mobility. From going in a bullock cart or a horse carriage to riding a bicycle to driving a car, you have to adapt to circumstances. And is your body flexible enough even to learn these new skills? So the critical element of the plasticity will be this adaptability of skills which will be required as you continue to stay long enough in life. So the second aspect is progressive. You can be plastic, but need not be sufficiently progressive. And this is where the skill factor, if you take all the way to its maximum, you find your skills have to grow. Take the example of a person who was trained in the industrial age to work with machines. The requirement of intelligence to work with physical machinery is relatively low. The same person now continues into the information technology age using computers to control the machines and having now to program computers. The requirement of intelligence is higher. If you wait another couple of decades perhaps, we're already very close to it, we will have this thing that you can plug onto your head, which will register your brain waves and thought patterns and take the command directly from your state of mind to move objects or do things on the screen. The technology exists already. A fighter pilot on some of these very advanced planes is able to think of turning right and the plane turns right, thinks of turning left and the plane turns left, thinks of firing his missile and the plane fires. And this is so critical because when you're turning very hard at high speed, your blood drains down, becomes heavy as lead, and you cannot move your hands. You have to rely on mind, which is your only vehicle. And even that mind now has the blood drained from it when you turn very hard. Can you maintain consciousness with less oxygen? Can you in that state maintain clarity and hold the will to turn right or left? Now you see, the training required here is much more of mind and self-awareness of mind and holding poise of thought even. Thought control would be a requirement for using tools such as these. As time passes, the compulsion of growth of consciousness is always there pressing on you. So, plasticity is a first requirement, but having made yourself plastic enough, how far can you continue to progress? And there's a point where you say, I'm sorry, I can't do it anymore. My brain is unable to take it. And what is your brain? Physical body, not your mind. It is your mind held in the limitations of the physical body that limits this capacity of the mind. The same mind detaching from the physical brain, going out in the subtle body, will say, yes, I can. My mind feels so much freer. I come back into my physical body and I feel the dulling influence immediately. And so what you see here is the body holding back even the mind because of inability to be plastic or progressive enough. But this plastic and progressive we have largely described in terms of its functions, what I have to do. But there is also the plastic and progressive of structure. Can the body actually change its working to become more supple physically in its structure? You will see this in many examples of young children. If they are trained from childhood, they are able to do extraordinary acrobatics. If they retain the training, they are able to maintain much of it all through the rest of their life. They are no different than us. We did not go through that training, and our body does not have the same plasticity in its structure. Take, for example, people who are able to bend their fingers all the way back and touch the hand, to touch the arm. It's possible for each one of us if we train ourselves to become sufficiently plastic. And yet over time the body tends to harden. But this is not enough. When we speak of structure, it can go still deeper. And here is the adaptability of the body to extremes. We have in the working of the body a reliance on certain microbial balances in the guts, in the intestines, which generate for us a large part of the nourishment. We are taught very simply in your textbooks that you eat food and that is digested somehow and absorbed. But the digestive process is not purely what happens in the body by its process, but also what is done afterwards by the bacteria in the gut, which continue the digestion and complete it. It is at that level that the bacteria often break down and build amino acids that are not there in the food. And so the interesting thing is, they will keep telling you that vegetarians don't have, they always have a depletion of vitamin B12 and certain other amino acids because the body cannot produce those. Not true. If your gut bacteria is healthy, the gut bacteria produces it and the body absorbs it. If you have taken antibiotics, your gut bacteria was destroyed and thereafter you have this problem. But if you regenerate the good gut bacteria, you do not have this problem anymore. There is in the body itself an extraordinary adaptability in its structural function. It is able to adjust to circumstances to a degree that we would consider impossible with our current medical knowledge, and yet it does happen. And I'll touch upon a more extreme kind. This is adaptability, for example, to food which doesn't have enough nutrition. The body will find a way to now build the nutrition from what you have limited capacity. But structure takes it even more to the bones and the muscles and their interconnection with other functions. And I'll touch upon one dramatic example here. All of us can hold our breath perhaps about a minute. With practice, you can extend it for about 2 minutes. And some of the best may push it to 2.5, and that's about it. There are divers who plunge into water and stay down 10 minutes. And some of them are in a family of divers who have been doing it. And we will say, fine, there's an adaptation which takes place with heredity. But there's more to it. If you were to go down 2 or 3 meters, the pressure of the water pressing on your lungs doubles. You go down another 2 or 3 meters, the pressure again now triples. Go another. It takes a point where beyond 10 meters, your lungs begin to be pressed so hard by the pressure from outside, your rib cage begins to be compressed. And if you continue further, your rib cage will actually crack. The bones will crack and your lungs will collapse from the water pressure. This is the physical reality. And yet there are divers who go down to a depth of 100 meters. Physically impossible for the human body. And yet they do it. And of course the science will say, well, something is very strange, let's study. And the study leads you to the conclusion that their body has become so flexible that their entire rib cage collapses. It's flexible enough. It collapses without breaking. It goes to that depth. And at that depth, the oxygen which is in the air, in the lungs, becomes now dissolved into the blood. And if you suddenly come out, the oxygen begins to form bubbles. And the bubbles will make your fine capillaries burst. Can lead to a burst in the brain, it can lead to a burst anywhere, your body starts bleeding all over if you come out too quickly. So deep sea divers, when they come out, they're put in a machine which has high pressure, and then over 24 hours or so, gradually the pressure is reduced so that the bubbles don't form. These divers go to the same depth or deeper, come up in 10 minutes and have no bends, none of this problem. How do you explain that? Well, what they did was they studied the actual mechanism and they discovered once they cross a certain depth, the body changes how it works with oxygen. It begins to operate differently. It uses the oxygen which is now dissolved into the blood and is able to access it in such a way that although you come up rapidly, it does not allow bubbles to form. Now here is a shift in the body's functioning which was not the result of a normal evolutionary process. It's not as if over many generations people dipped half a meter more and half a meter more. In fact, the surprising thing is, those people who do it, they train others. Now, anybody reasonably healthy in the age of 20s or 30s can go through the training program and develop this capacity. And this means it is not an evolutionary development, it is actually an adaptability of the body in its structure and its functioning. But such a dramatic adaptation that it brings it very close to exactly what happens in dolphins. When dolphins plunge so deep, they do not get bends either. They hold their breath for as long, and their rib cage collapses under pressure of the water, and they're completely calm and clear. They do not go unconscious, and they return. And these human beings have adapted to become like dolphins in all of the physiological working. And science only can observe without explaining how this was possible. But it shows that in your body there is an extraordinary capacity of plasticity and progress, both in its structure and in its functioning, which we will need to gradually tap and develop as far as we can go. If the body is to be continued also, as long as the soul chooses to keep it. If you want a practical physical immortality, this would be a requirement also. And how far should this plasticity and progressiveness be? That it would answer to each change demanded of it by the progress of the inner person, person capital P. Now, we will not be required to perhaps dive in deep sea. That may not be a requirement, but if it is, well, that also will be part of the adaptation. But obviously, we're speaking here of a much more accessible degree of plasticity and progressiveness. But still, you cannot conceive of what will happen after a few hundred years in terms of demand for progressiveness. It must be able to keep pace with the soul in its formation of self-expressive personality. And there is more. But here, Sri Aurobindo has put a footnote where he says, the body should answer to each change demanded of it by the progress of the inner person. And the footnote is like this. I read the whole thing first. Even if science, physical science or occult science, were to discover the necessary conditions or means for an indefinite survival of the body, still, if the body could not adapt itself so as to become a fit instrument of expression for the inner growth, the soul would find some way to abandon it and pass on to a new incarnation. The material or physical causes of death are not its soul or its true cause. Its true inmost reason is the spiritual necessity for the evolution of a new being. Now, Sri Aurobindo rarely uses footnotes. At best, as a footnote, he will throw in a word, a Sanskrit term corresponding to the English word he has used. But here's a long explanation. And it's because this whole explanation is critical to our understanding of the demand of the inner person on the body. Who decides and on what basis? He says that we think the physical cause or material cause of death is the true cause or the sole cause. We had an accident, somebody got bumped, there was an injury, something broke down, there was a decline of some chemicals, and so there was a breakdown, and so on. And he says, no. The true inmost reason is the spiritual necessity for the evolution of a new being. Now, he's used two words, true and inmost. There is a superficial reason as distinct from an inmost reason. The superficial reason might be the blood pressure was dropping, or the heart was becoming weak and there was a leakage and there was a heart attack, and so the person died. So when you ask a doctor what happened, cause of death, massive heart attack. Unexpected. Recently it happened to a friend of ours. Her father had some discomfort, so they went and did all the checkup because he had a history of heart disease. All the checkups came completely normal. And then a few days later, poof, just like that, he left. Doctor will study and say, massive heart attack. What were the signs of it? None. And how do you explain this? And the only thing you notice is 3 or 4 days before he left, he was very quiet and he was indrawn. And you know immediately that there was a choice that was made somewhere within, deep within, not on the surface. And when the inner choice was made and it was exercised upon the body, it used the weakest part of the body, which was the heart, which was in a pretty good condition otherwise. It used the weakest part to begin the shutdown process. How does it do that? It simply withdraws the vitality which is infused into the body and begins to reabsorb it back. Disengage it from the body. And what happens is all the biological functions begin to rapidly drop. The first thing to fail is the weakest point, and then a chain reaction follows. Very simply. Effectively, if you use the analogy, when you're leaving your house to go for a long trip, before you lock the door, what do? You turn off the water taps, switch off all the lights, close the windows, close the doors, and leave. So if somebody did not see you doing it and they saw only the physical reality of the house, they would say, I don't know what happened. Suddenly the electricity goes, the water goes, the windows start closing, and now of course the house is dead. Right? Because you're seeing only the physical reality. Because the energy was withdrawn by the choice of the soul. And therefore, it is the inmost reason. There is an external reason, of course, the heart shut down. But the inmost reason was the soul's choice. And the true reason is also the soul's choice. Because the heart could have been pushed, could have been triggered, could have been dragged on. We have seen examples, and have seen this in the most extraordinary example is of Huta, the one who mother trained as an artist, who did those wonderful paintings. And she had decided that she would quit only on the same day on which the mother left her body, November 17th. But meanwhile, her body had been deteriorating, and a full 2 months before or 3 months before, we could see all the biological parameters had dropped dramatically. The body had basically become just skin and bone. Her blood tests showed such a low level of sodium and potassium, she should not even be conscious. And yet she was conscious, she was functioning, struggling in great physical pain and discomfort, but she just held on. And I had occasion to interact with her during that time, to see that, and it was very disturbing. But what it demonstrated was the soul's choice can literally drag the body with it, even though the body is physically dysfunctional. And all the medical parameters should not allow it to remain conscious and functional, and yet. And that's why he uses the word the true reason. In fact, the true reason why we are alive is the soul's choice. The inmost reason why we are healthy is the soul's choice. And although things can be messed around externally, the soul's choice can override to a great extent. And again, I take an example of a person who was in coma, technically brain dead for whatever number of months. And when the soul decided now to leave, she opened her eyes fully, engaged, not in full conversation because the biology had degraded or maybe whatever the cause, fully engaged visually, making contact with everybody, and then withdrew and left. Equally, there are cases where people have completely come forward with full engagement on all activity and then withdrawn, just to say goodbye. It means the soul had the power to push forward and assert itself, and was accepting to remain in a passive poise for whatever reason. And although there may be external degeneration of the brain, or nervous system, or body, which would make that passive poise necessary superficially, still the soul has the power to override all that where necessary. And that's why he uses these two words, true reason and inmost reason, is the spiritual necessity for the evolution of a new being. So, we go back to the first sentence of this footnote. Even if science, and then again a parenthetical statement, physical science or occult science were to discover the necessary conditions or means for an indefinite survival of the body. And again, a very important suggestion is thrown, that not only there are physical means by which you can extend the body's life in a reasonably good health, but there are equally occult means. After all, if you look at the relationship of physical science with occult science, the occult science is the principle upon which the physical science operates. So the physical science is a reduced, externalized working of a broader range of knowledge of processes and powers, which actually go into what we call occult. And occult only because they're hidden. You do not see the causes, the true mechanism behind. So for example, physically, you may see electricity. You can generate electricity by chemical means. But what you realize is the physical electricity is only the densest grade of working of a condensed life force, prana, which is the true electricity. And if you can concretize the prana into a certain degree of condensation, you will actually produce physical electric effects without necessarily detecting physical electricity. If you further densify it, you will even detect the physical electricity. And this is the only explanation you have for phenomena, what they call psychic phenomena, where a person sitting in a laboratory is asked to concentrate to produce a certain effect, and they're measuring everything around him. As he concentrates, the ambient voltage in the air shoots up to 300 volts or 400 volts. Where is the electricity coming from? Not from chemical reactions, but the concentration of life force which is densified for the particular effect he is trying to produce. And that is registered as electric phenomena. So if you operate only on the level of the life energy, you would produce the same result as the electrical means done by physical science. But if you recognize the difference between the two, the physical science is bound to physical means. When my chemical is exhausted, my battery cannot produce electricity. But when I operate by occult means, one can draw the prana to whatever extent you choose, not needing to be exhausted by chemical means. And so there are always, anything that can be done by physical means can also be done by occult means. Equally, one could say, if anything can be achieved by occult means, there is a way eventually that can be found to replicate it by physical means. Except physical means would be more bound to physical circumstances, occult means would be more fluid. But now we need to extend this logic a step further. Occult means themselves are a representation of spiritual realities. And if you can rise up to the spiritual consciousness, all life force, all awareness is only a special functioning of the spiritual consciousness, which is infinite, which is unconditioned, which is utterly free to be able to exercise itself. And therefore, a spiritually developed consciousness can simply will itself to act, to produce exactly the same phenomena that another would produce by occult means, or a third would produce by physical means. But the difference would be the spiritual means would be completely free, open to the conscious will to exercise itself and do whatever is required. You will recall the mother once narrating how there was an occult attack on Sri Aurobindo when he was in the early days in the guest house. Somebody wanted to harm and stones were appearing. And you probably remember that incident. And mother spoke of how she saw certain symbols which had been drawn on the wall as a focal point for the attack. And of course they did whatever was needed to neutralize it. But then mother said she summoned the beings who were behind it to see what was the mechanism used. And immediately 3 dwarf-like beings appeared before her. And then she had this interaction with them. Now if you ask, how did she summon? An occult means would be the guy will say, all right, I need to have a little bit of camphor, I need to have a little bit of this stick or that medicine or whatever the mechanism they use, and then do a ritual and draw symbols and do some invocations, and then those beings would appear. That would be the occult mechanism. What did mother do? She reached out in her universal or cosmic consciousness, and the will sensing the energy and the nature of the thing done simply drew it, and that was all. She summoned and they were there. In terms of efficacy, so much more effective, not requiring any specialized technique or knowledge, simply a choice of a will made and the work is done. You will recall mother in later years when speaking of these and other phenomena, she said, I had studied occultism in those days, but now I've forgotten all that. Meaning you don't need it really. If you'd grow in spiritual consciousness increasingly, the reality is spiritual, and all else is only a condensed and narrower version of the spirit that can act freely. So we will throw in here that spiritual means also are possible for the extension of the body. And those spiritual means precisely are the supramental action and transformation of the physical consciousness. which would lead to the true immortality of the physical body. And we read the rest of the sentence. He limits it to physical science and occult science. If science were to discover the necessary conditions or means for an indefinite survival of the body, still, if the body could not adapt itself so as to become a fit instrument of expression for the inner growth, the soul would find some way to abandon it. What does the soul do? It's not bound to the body. The body needs the soul. So the soul can simply say, all right, done, now I need to get rid of this. And that's all. And pass on to a new incarnation. So it can be simply, as we saw, shutting down the life energy functions, or it can even use an accident. The mother makes an observation about this. She says that often when an accident is in process of happening, that is, the cause and effect chains of, well, let's say karmic chains of cause and effect have sufficiently hardened that now the accident has to happen, then souls which are preparing to leave, they tend to accumulate in the environment of the accident and use it as a means of exit. I recall reading this, I think it was in the life of Edgar Cayce. He had clairvoyant vision, and he describes this incident where he had a dream. I'm mixing two incidents, maybe. Let me narrate both. He had a dream in which he saw somebody carrying, an undertaker carrying a coffin, and he asks, whose is this? And he's told it is yours. And next day, he is about to enter a lift, and he sees the lift man exactly the same face as his undertaker. And so the shock throws him back, the lift closes, and it crashes. But there's another incident, and I'm now confusing the source of it. But in this case, the person who was clairvoyant was about to enter the lift, and something about it was so strange, he stopped in shock, and then the lift door closed, and he realized nobody in the lift had an aura. And then the lift crashed. And that shows you already the soul had begun the withdrawal process. The aura had pretty much dimmed because the withdrawal had begun, and then only the incident was used as a means of quick departure. So we are getting into a space which is very complex, because the human mind asks all kinds of strange questions. What about? What about? And the mother, in one of her discussions, says, if, for example, there's a crash which is about to take place in a large vehicle or aircraft or train, whatever form, even if there's one person who is not ready to quit, the entire accident can be averted. Or sometimes the opposite happens. If there is one person who has such a strong, compelling, destructive energy, well, everybody can get pulled into it. So there's a lot of complex possibilities of the play. What matters is for us practically, when we think of these things, it's better not to get too much into it, but what matters practically for us is that we remain in affinity and alignment with the divine in whatever way we can, to whatever degree. And so I'll end this rather gory part of the discussion with an incident which Udar narrated to us. He had to go for some work, and he was traveling by train, and somewhere in the middle of the journey, the train had a head-on collision with another train. The other train completely fell over, many died, but the train on which he was literally jumped off the track and fell on the side of the track without toppling over. Nobody was injured. Minor scratches and bruises. And so, rather than continuing his journey, he just came back and went straight to the mother. And the way he narrated to us, he said, I went straight to the mother, and before I could say anything, mother said to me, I was not sure in which bogie you were in, so I had to save the whole train. It used to be a rule in those days that any time people left, even for a local picnic, the mother would ask for a complete list of all the names of the people going, the exact detailed itinerary with timings, locations as it was planned to be given to her. And it was for this reason. Because there would be the automatic protection that she would place for that purpose, for that duration. And in this case, when she saw the danger, since she did not know specifics, there was an intervention which was done on the entire train. Another example which comes to mind, also narrated by him, when there was a ship which brought from Europe the first generator for the ashram. It was a massive thing. It is still present there. It is many tons. And it was so heavy that they did not have enough strength of the cranes to lift it and bring it across. So they had to load 2 cranes on the pier, the same pier now which is broken here near the Gandhi statue. So these 2 cranes were lifting the generator with 2 of these cords, and they miscalculated the weight and the ability of the cranes to take the weight. And as they started to lift the generator, the cranes began to tilt forward. Now that would have been disastrous. The generator would have collapsed, the cranes would have collapsed, people below who were in the boat, everything would have been destroyed. As it began to tilt forward, somehow the cranes swung inward, and the generator, which had been partly lifted up, just swung in neatly and fell directly on the pier instead of on the water. Now it was an intervention which was so dramatic that the captain, who was not interested in the ashram, he said, "Oh, what is this spirituality? I don't believe in it unless I see a miracle." So the captain was so shocked seeing this. He said to Udar, "I think I've seen my miracle, but I'm scared of going to your ashram." And he left in haste. But it shows that in circumstances like this also, an intervention from the spiritual consciousness can make some very simple, smooth resolutions. What would have been a disaster becomes a very smooth action that simply finishes the work. All of these are possible. What is important for us is to remain in alignment with the divine consciousness, and there is with it almost an automatic protection. We can, of course, always call for a help or a protection, or equally for a guidance. So, this is an aside. We have strayed a little bit from the topic. But here, the idea simply is the soul would find some way to abandon the body and pass on to a new incarnation, even if the body could be extended as much as it wants to. So what is the requirement for the body? Why this plasticity and progressiveness? It must be able to keep pace with the soul in its formation of self-expressive personality. What's the body doing? What is the whole point of the incarnation? The soul has within it infinite potential, of which it is drawing out itself, its personality, expressing and organizing its powers into the mind, life, and matter. So, form of self-expressive personality. The personality expressing itself, taking on forms in the mind, in the vital, and in the physical body. So, keep pace with the soul in its formation of self-expressive personality. This is the first requirement. Second, its long unfolding of a secret spiritual divinity. And third, and the slow transformation of the mental into the divine mental or spiritual existence. So 3 things really are the change with which the body must be able to keep up with. The first was this formation of self-expressive personality. Within me now, as my personality wants to express itself now as an artist, can my body keep up with that artistic need? Within me, as there is the need for a self-expression of the thinker, the philosopher, can my body now keep up with this? Within me, there is a need now to express myself in dance, in movement. Can the body keep up with it? So, formation of self-expressive personality, the body should not be offering any hindrance, must be plastic. The second thing was long unfolding of a secret spiritual divinity. What's happening all the while? The divinity within, which is the soul, secret, is now drawing out, unfolding itself, but across how many years? Across how many lifetimes? If you really take it seriously, you will see It is far longer than what modern history speaks of as human beings on earth. We have evidence of humanity being on earth going back much longer than what science speaks. Science speaks of the thinking human, the Homo sapiens. Before that, it speaks of other types of hominids and varieties of types of hominids, which are supposedly not intelligent enough, not capable enough, and so on, which are mostly animal. And this last period of Homo sapiens, I believe, is officially something like 250,000 years or less. But we have evidence of things going back a few million years, which are regularly found when they dig in mines. And because it does not fit the current narrative, the evidence is dismissed by speaking of mixture of multiple levels of the archaeological evidence of the soil. And it's dismissed, set aside. Except occasionally we have also carbon dating, which goes back so far. We have human footprints at the time of the dinosaurs, next to the dinosaurs in the same space. There are pictures in Brazil drawn on stone of human beings fighting dinosaurs and others, some pretty amazing things. Too amazing even to speak of, people are stunned. There's actually one of the drawings which is of a person whose head is cut open and the brain removed. And the full drawing of the brain with all those typical pictures which you see, all carved into stone. How do you explain this? We have in ancient texts, and in India particularly in the Mahabharata, descriptions of technologies which are so much more advanced. The traditions, the Greek traditions, I believe it is Plato who describes the evidence of Atlantis, for which he saw documentation during his visit to Egypt. But also things which you see in physical form of stone in the Egyptian pyramids or across the world in various kinds of pyramids, which cannot be explained by any current technology even. You have gigantic stones of 20, 30, sometimes 100 tons, which are sitting on top of others in a curvature that fits exactly, that you cannot pass a piece of paper in it. It requires some extraordinary knowledge which you cannot explain from Cro-Magnon man or even Homo sapiens going back a few thousand years. And so we have to recognize all of these histories are very superficial. We've been around for a few million years. If you go to the occult history, the Theosophists have a lot of documentation on that. And if you accept that we've been around a few million years, consider how much the evolution has taken us to where we are. In consciousness terms, where it must have been a couple of million years ago. Considering that we have a new incarnation every 100 years typically. Or even if you allow for a gap of 200 years, still, it makes for so many incarnations, so many steps of evolution that we have all been through, of which we remember nothing. And this is a long unfolding of the secret spiritual divinity. And whatever it has done so far has brought the body to this level of development. And what it wants to do now is a huge acceleration. An acceleration that even within 2 or 3 cycles of birth should be able to get us to some experience of divinization in the body. And this is the kind of pace that needs to be picked up in this long unfolding of secret spiritual divinity coming forward more and more, using the body as its vehicle. And the slow transformation of the mental into the divine mental or spiritual existence. And if you go back a million years or two, you'll find the mind quite developed, reasonably intelligent. Not yet perhaps utterly self-aware and capable of self-mastery, but certainly intelligent enough that it could function in almost everything human beings do today. But that mind has grown from there to a level of self-awareness which is capable of not only self-mastery, but capable of opening to a higher divine consciousness, which can infuse into the mind and make it of a different grade. Those gradations Sri Aurobindo has described as higher mind, illumined mind, intuitive mind, all of these would be diviner steps of the mind consciousness growing well before it reaches even the overmental or supramental level. All of these belong to the spiritual domain. Strictly speaking, the spiritual consciousness is that which is able to experience the oneness. And our rational thinking mind is an instrument of division. But the moment we enter into what Sri Aurobindo has described as the higher mind, where the thoughts themselves are large and all-encompassing, they are thoughts of the self. In that consciousness, you are aware of the presence of the self as a backdrop. That all thoughts are seen or have value in relation to the presence of the self, which is like the backdrop. Unlike the thinking mind in which we are now, where the self is removed and so we see things only in pieces. In the higher mind, you still have thought forms, thought processes, but they are large and inclusive because there is always the context of the self. And from thereafter, every single step further, in the illumined mind you can see there's no more thinking, there is rather the seeing of the knowledge in the light of the self which fills your mind. In the intuitive consciousness, you have the contact in the experience of knowledge in identity, in the touch of the self. Not yet the full revelation, but the touch. And in the touch is the intuitive identity of consciousness, of knowledge, capable of being error-free within a limitation. In the over-mental consciousness, it is no more a touch, it is more like an embrace, but one of the many infinite forms of embrace or aspects of embrace. And in the supramental consciousness, you have the oneness with the totality of the self, the way self knows itself in its oneness. So if you think about it in these terms, the moment you move out from the rational thinking mind, the very first step of the higher mind is already an approach to self and the beginning of the spiritual gradations of mind. Now, this would not be the case going back 1,000,000 years or even going back 10,000 years. Because at that point, the mind in the general population was still not close enough to be able to make that last step. We have now reached that stage where we just have to make one little step and begin to enter in relation with the spiritual ranges of mind. So, he describes this long journey, slow transformation of the mental into the divine mental or spiritual existence. And it's a slow transformation because that's how the pace of evolution so far has been, except you can accelerate by the yoga. So all of this which we have now described can be enormously accelerated by the yoga. Increasingly, as the inner consciousness now begins to fill the mind, vital and the physical, its action makes it more and more plastic, more and more progressive, and the adaptation of the structure and functioning, etc. All of these would begin to happen. This consummation of a triple immortality, immortality of the nature, completing the essential immortality of the spirit, and the psychic survival of death, might be the crown of rebirth and a momentous indication of the conquest of the material inconscience and ignorance, even in the very foundation of the reign of matter. So if you take it all the way to the physical body, this would be a great conquest. Earlier, remember, he spoke of immense victory of the soul, mind and life over the inconscience. But with this, it would be the crown of rebirth and the momentous indication of conquest of material inconscience and ignorance in the foundations of matter itself. What is it that would be this conquest? The triple immortality. Immortality of the nature, completing the essential immortality of the spirit, and the psychic survival of death. Meaning, so far the spirit was immortal, our nature was mortal. Bit by bit we have taken the mind into that immortality, then the vital, and now even your physical nature has been taken into spirit's immortality. And your whole psyche, the whole personality, on a deeper level, is able to survive death and continue as long as it chooses. And so he says, crown of rebirth. He does not say the end of rebirth. It is the crown of rebirth. Now rebirth is there only as convenience where necessary, or rather rebirth is taking place at each step of the journey. You are always reshaping, recasting yourself as you grow into higher and higher grades of consciousness and physical expression of that consciousness. But the true immortality would still be the eternity of the spirit. This is not yet the true immortality. As we have seen, it is still a consciousness that is living in limitation. It does not have, like the spirit, the knowledge of the oneness which is never lost. So if you take the body in such a circumstance, while it is plastic and it can be carried, the body itself is not able to share in the experience of the oneness of the spirit. That would happen in a supramental transformation. So very clearly what he is describing here is not the supramental transformation. What it suggests is, well before the supramental transformation, we would be able to, in principle, even extend the physical life for unusually long or even without particular limits, as long as these conditions were fulfilled. But the true immortality would still be the eternity of the spirit. The physical survival could only be relative, terminable at will, a temporary sign of the spirit's victory here over death and matter. So what you have achieved by such means would be great, but the physical survival is relative. Relative meaning you can extend as long as you want, relatively, but at some point the soul might still say, all right, I think I need to drop this and take a new body. So, terminable at will. It's not the true permanence of the supramental consciousness itself. And therefore, temporary sign of spirit's victory. In the supramental consciousness, the body itself would know spirit and share in the spirit's immortality. Its substance would be divinized. Its substance would be spirit expressing itself in the density of matter. And so that would be an altogether different achievement, and that would not be temporary, that would be the true and permanent victory of the spirit over matter and death. So with this, Sri Aurobindo completes the chapter Rebirth and Other Worlds, and we have seen why this is so important for us, particularly at this time in human evolution. We have had extraordinary gifts in this lifetime, from either direct or indirect contact with this knowledge, with the Divine Mother's presence, physical or spiritual, in whatever way we have been in that contact. What we have received and built up in this life through whatever number of years or decades that we have worked upon the consciousness and its growth, it would be a pity if we had to lose it and start all over again and struggle in much more difficult circumstances of a society which is much more confused, perhaps, as you see the trend developing today. It would be a pity if we had to lose and start and again wander through the same struggles that we have had to. And it is a necessity, the mother says in one of her conversations, to be able to maintain continuity of consciousness so that we have enough time to complete the full transformation of the mind, life and matter. Now, even if we were to supramentalize the mind and the life, leaving aside the physical, maintaining that only as a support temporarily, that process would take longer than a conventional human lifetime provides. And so the necessity of this continuity is so important, and we need to work upon it for our purpose. The next chapter, Sri Aurobindo takes up the nature of this spiritual evolution in the context of human evolution. It's called Man and the Evolution, which we will begin next time. But for now, I wanted to read from two of Mother's conversations in her questions and answers, which are directly relevant to what we have just studied. Here she speaks of the role of the physical body. In an earlier part of the discussion of the text we have just read, you recall that the body was left by most spiritual traditions as a shell or a temporary support or a domain of ignorance, inconscience, and so on. It is a domain of resistance, of inertia and dullness. And yet, within it is a secret which is held. We discussed that time before last, when we discussed the phrase Aurobindo uses of the struggle of spirit and its conquest over matter. Why is there this struggle? Why is matter resisting, and what are the conditions of of the victory of the spirit? So a little bit about this, the mother speaks of in a different context. Somebody asked, how can you enter the vital domain, the vital worlds, and experience things there? And she says, there you are totally exposed to energies, because it's the domain of energy. And because form is not the primary base, all energy penetrates everyone else. Your energy penetrates the environment, environmental energies penetrate you, and you are completely exposed to all the currents of energies happening there. That's generally what happens during a nightmare, where you have gone into a nasty place in the vital world. And she says, I read here, directly you enter any realm of this world, its beings gather around you and want to encompass and get out of you all you have, to draw what they can and make it a food and a prey. If you have no strong light and force radiating from within you, you move there without your body, as if you had no coat to protect you against a chill and bleak atmosphere, no house to shield you, even no skin covering you, your nerves exposed and bare. There are men who say, how unhappy I am in this body, and think of death as an escape. But after death, you have the same vital surroundings and are in danger from the same forces that are the cause of your misery in this life. The dissolution of the body forces you out into the open spaces of the vital world, and you have no longer a defense. There is not the physical body any longer to rush back to for safety. Now, we touched upon this idea in earlier discussions. If, as happens in the battlefield, a soldier's body is blown out, he's now in the vital body. What happens? The physical protection is gone, but you're completely now exposed. What mood you had, the state you were in, I am unhappy, your body is knocked out, I am still unhappy. I am still surrounded by the same atmosphere of unhappiness, except now I do not have the protection anymore. So it's not freedom or escape in death. You enter the same state of consciousness in the vital body now without the physical protection. And that's why you have, nightmares or the purgatory passage which is described in religions. And so Mother says, because of this, it is here upon earth, in the body itself, that you must acquire a complete knowledge and learn to use a full and complete power. Only when you have done that will you be free to move about with entire security in all the worlds. Only when you are incapable of having the slightest fear, when you remain unmoved, for example, in the midst of the worst nightmare, can you say, now I am ready to go into the vital world. But this means the acquisition of a power and a knowledge that can come only when you are a perfect master of the impulses and desires of the vital nature. You must be absolutely free from everything that can bring in the beings of the darkness or allow them to rule over you. If you are not free, beware. So what do you need to be able to wander the vital world safely? No attachments, no desires, no impulses, no preferences, perfect equanimity, unchanging peace and absolute faith in the divine protection. And with that, you are safe. Without it, you are in peril, not danger, peril, extreme danger. And as long as you are not safe, it is better to do like little chickens that take shelter under the mother's wings. Now what does she say here? She's saying you have to prepare this capacity while in the body. If you prematurely expose yourself to those domains, well, you have no protection, you get overwhelmed. Where do you have protection? When you get back into the body. And so in this protected space, you have to build this no attachment, no desire, no impulse, no preference, perfect equanimity, unchanging peace, absolute faith. In a protected space. When that is built, of course, you're free to wander around. Now you see the importance of the body. And the importance precisely of the dullness that the body offers you. Because it is the dullness which is the protection. So in the next paragraph, someone asks, how does the physical body act as a protection? And she answers, the physical body acts as a protection by its grossness. By the very thing we charge against it. Here you were criticizing the body, oh, this is so dull and gross. It is dull and insensitive, thick, rigid and hard. It is like a fortress with strong, dense walls. The vital world is fluidic. There things move and mix and interpenetrate freely. It is like the waves of the sea that ceaselessly flow into each other and change and mingle. Against this fluidity of the vital world, you are defenseless unless you can oppose to it a very powerful light and force from inside. Otherwise it penetrates you and there is nothing to hamper its invading influence. But the body intervenes, cuts you off from the vital world, and is a dam against the flood of its forces. And someone asks, but is there any individuality in the forms of the vital world? Individuality there is, only its forms are not so fixed and hard as the forms of embodied things. Individuality does not mean an unplastic rigidity. A stone has a very rigid form, perhaps the most rigid we know, but there's very little individuality in it. Take 10 or 20 stones together and you will have to be very careful if you want to discern between them. You see, there's no individuality there. But the beings of the vital world can be recognized at the very first sight, one from another. You distinguish them by something in the way in which the form is built, by the atmosphere which it carries with it, by the manner in which each moves and speaks and acts. You see, we use all this, she is giving precise words, but we say vibes. I recognize from the vibes that it is so and so. You see? But she gives you all the details of what the vibes mean. As human beings change their expression according as they are happy or angry, these beings also undergo change in the stress of their moods. But the alteration is more intense in the vital world. Not only the mere expression, but the very form of the features change. I wanted to read this part because it gives you an idea of the kind of plasticity which consciousness has but does not have in the physical. In the mental or vital, literally the form changes according to the mood. You're happy, the whole being becomes glowing. You're unhappy, angry, the whole being changes shape. You'll see some of this represented in cartoon movies, where the form of the cartoon character is plastic. And so when he gets angry, he goes, oh, and he becomes like this. And then when he's happy, he becomes like... And the full shift of the form is typical of the vital worlds. Even more dramatic than what the cartoons will show. But the moment you come into the physical body, there's this dulling, narrowing, rigidity. Now if you see what the plasticity of the physical form would imply, it too should be plastic to express what the soul wants to express in its joy, in its love, in it the peace that it expresses, and in the various moods and colors of moods. And there is one example which I have shared before in other contexts and I will want to share here. The mother's body was so plastic. She had made her body so plastic by the spiritualization of the physical consciousness, to a degree that people saw the body, literally the face change. There were examples of people who saw the mother during the darshan, and this person came back saying, it was the most beautiful young woman. How can you say she was 80 years old? And mother said what he saw was her subtle physical body. But those who saw even her physical body, her attendants who were with her, they said the face was different. morning, afternoon, evening. And so someone wrote to Sri Aurobindo, is it true or is it just my imagination? And Sri Aurobindo's reply in the letters, he writes, yes, it is true. Her body is plastic enough that it changes physically the form to express the state of her consciousness. And one experience which I want to narrate, which was the most extreme of this, was narrated to us by a Frenchman who was a teacher in the school. His name was Tanmaya. He was a close friend with another Frenchman, Pavitra. And when Pavitra passed away, Tanmaya was very unhappy. He was in depression, he was weeping. And I've heard this from him. We have it on record, we recorded his conversation. He narrated how he went to the mother weeping, and the mother first tried to console him. Then she said, why do you cry? He is inside me. So he says, yes, but I miss him. And mother says, but he's inside me. And again he says, but I miss him. And finally mother said, do you want to see him? He's inside me. And he didn't know what she's talking about. And he looked at her, and as she smiled, he said, her face changed form, like fluid substance. It changed form and became the face of Pavitra, smiling at him. He was so astounded. When he was narrating the incident, he had tears in his eyes. What it meant that he is inside me was even not just the consciousness, but literally the form of the consciousness that it was familiar with, she could express, or her body was plastic enough to take that form. A very interesting observation that the mother makes: in the supramental body, it will not have teeth. Why do you need teeth? Because you need a hard part that will crush food. But if your body's tissue is capable of being hard or soft on demand, well, you do not need it, right? If you take your fingers, you can lift an object softly. You can also crush an object. If the tissue itself is capable of is plastic enough to become hard or soft as needed, even change form, the physical character of the teeth and the rigidity would be pointless. In fact, it would be rigidity. It is inconscience in the body when it is rigid. Bones and teeth represent the inconscient. And when the body is freed from inconscience, it becomes necessarily conscious and therefore plastically responsive to consciousness, and is able to harden or soften as it needs. And the whole working at a structural level would be different in the supramental consciousness. And there's another conversation which I wanted to read from, which corresponds to the discussion earlier about the conditions of necessity of individualization and why that is required. But here it is again in a slightly modified context. The question to the mother was, at the time of death, the psychic being takes rest, but what happens to the vital? And she says her answer, but the vital does not go to rest, nor does the mental being. Generally they are dissolved. And then she explains, it is only if one has followed a yoga throughout his whole life, if one has taken great care to individualize, to centralize the vital and the mental around the psychic being, that they remain. That happens once in a million cases. It is very exceptional. Take the case of a philosopher or a writer who has worked considerably in his brain, tried to organize it. Then that persists, but as a capacity to think, not the full mental body, only as a capacity to think. Nothing else. There are these capacities of thinking which persist after death, and they try naturally to find another physical brain in which to manifest. It is in this way that the mind of a great thinker may identify itself with another mind and be able to express it. So there's another letter of Sri Aurobindo where he discusses how this reincarnation is much more complex than people understand, in a soul just popping from one body to the next. All these parts of organized mind or vital can actually attach themselves to other beings. Now suppose your mind has an affinity to the mind organization of Shakespeare. Literally an imprint of that mind can fuse into your mind. You will feel in your mind even the feeling of Shakespeare's thoughts or memories. and his style of writing. And somebody outside would say, oh, he's an incarnation of Shakespeare. Meanwhile, the soul has gone on to another body with a very different journey. So you see, there is a mixture of these capacities or powers that can actually transfer across. And yet they are in some kind of a shared evolution. But it's not the body of the whole mental being. For that, she says, if one has followed a yoga throughout his whole life, if one has taken great care to individualize, to centralize the vital and mental around the psychic being, that they remain, then only the vital and mental body is retained and carried over. And that's what we saw Sri Aurobindo describing, but here in a different vocabulary. She also gives the example of a good musician who has organized the power of playing music in his body and in his hands. Then his hands, for instance, are so individualized in their ability to play that they can persist subtly even after death with their form, a form analogous to the old physical form. They float in the vital world and are attracted by people who have similar capacities. They try to become identified with them. A person who is sensitive enough, receptive enough, can become identified with these hands and execute wonderful things, profit by all the individualization of the past life of these hands. She even gives the example of a scientist, Pierre Curie. When he passed away, his mind joined into his wife's, Marie Curie, who then continued the same work that he was doing, although she didn't have the same training as him, and so on. So the point of reading this was the individualization can be partial in capacities, but it can be whole in the whole mental being if that is organized around the psychic being. So in conclusion to this chapter that we have read, the key for us will be consciously to organize all of our mental being, all the thoughts, all the skills of mind, all the particular powers, faculties of the intelligence and the mental awareness. Organize all this around the psychic being. Which means what? Two ways. First, put all these in reference to the psychic in all that they do. Second, bring the psychic influence into all these in all that they do. So it's a two-way contact. You start thinking, I'm thinking this, that, or the other. What is the value of these thoughts in relation to my psychic presence? And only those thoughts which are supportive of and nourishing to the psychic being are now becoming more and more important. The other thoughts, gossip, criticism, and negative thinking of things, well, they kind of fade, they have no more a place. But the thoughts now, or the mind itself now turns to the psychic as its center of reference for its values. At the same time, the mind turns to it. It also then tries to feel the psychic influence and draw it, fill it into its thinking, fill it into its values, into its art, into its music, into its relations, into its values of its relations, and so on. And a similar process in the heart, in the emotions, and even in your energies and the instinctive forms of your energies. When you're going to start cycling, you're going to start walking, climbing steps. You could do it instinctively, as we all do. I have to get up there, I'm late, I run. I'm not conscious of what my legs are doing. But if at that point I pause, I become conscious of the presence within and feel its influence into my legs, or invite its influence into my legs, or make each step of the legs moving, climbing, conscious, and open that consciousness or align it to my deeper aspiration. Then that psychic influence will begin to fill, and the walking activity itself will become woven into, centered around the psychic presence. And so it means everything you do in your life in meticulous detail should be organized around this center and integrated around it. Then you will be able to carry a large part of your conscious individuality into the next. Very simply, as an exercise, this is what we would do practically. Of course, Sri Aurobindo's description and the three requirements now define the terms of this attunement and the organization around the psychic being, how far it should be taken, how complete it should become, and so on. But still, this is the central means by which we have to build this, prepare for this continuity of the consciousness. We'll continue this next Sunday, and we can meditate on it for a few minutes before we disperse.